Numbers 1. God told Moses, "Count up all the people from the 12 tribes of Israel, every man 20 and older who can fight. Get them ready for battle." Moses and Aaron got to work, calling on the leaders of each tribe to help with the count. They went tribe by tribe, family by family, and recorded the numbers.
Reuben, 46,500. Simeon, 59,300. Gad, 45,650.
Judah, 74,600. Issachar, 54,400.
Zebulun, 57,400. Ephraim, 40,500. Manasseh, 32,200. Benjamin, 35,400.
Dan, 62,700.
Asher, 41,500. Naphtali, 53,400.
Altogether, that was 603,550 men ready for battle. But God had a different plan for the Levites. He told Moses, "Don't count them with the others. Their job isn't to fight, it's to take care of the tabernacle." The Levites were in charge of the holy things, setting up, taking down, and guarding God's dwelling place. When the people moved, they moved the tabernacle too. If anyone outside their tribe tried to mess with it, they'd be in trouble. God made it clear. Every tribe had its place around the camp, and the Levites would camp closest to the tabernacle, standing as its protectors. So, Moses followed God's instructions, got the people organized, and set them up for what was ahead. Numbers 2. God gave Moses instructions on how the Israelites should set up their camp. Everybody had a designated spot, and they had to stick to it. The 12 tribes were divided into 4 groups, each positioned around the tabernacle in an orderly way. The camp setup: east side, leading the camp, Judah's group. Judah, 74,600. Issachar, 54,400. Zebulun, 57,400. Total, 186,400. They moved first when the camp set out. South side, Reuben's group. Reuben, 46,500. Simeon, 59,300. Gad, 45,650. Total, 151,450. They moved second. Center, the Levites. The Levites camped around the tabernacle and carried it when the people moved. West side, Ephraim's group. Ephraim, 40,500. Manasseh, 32,200. Benjamin, 35,400. Total, 108,100. They moved third. North side, Dan's group. Dan, 62,700. Asher, 41,500. Naphtali, 53,400. Total, 157,600. They moved last, acting as the rear guard. Altogether, there were 603,550 men ready for battle, not counting the Levites. God set this order for a reason. Everything had to be structured. The tabernacle stayed at the center, showing that God was the focus of their journey. When they moved, they did it in the right order. Nobody was out here just wandering randomly. Everybody had a place and a purpose. Moses and the Israelites followed the plan exactly as God told them. Numbers 3. Now God gave Moses the details about the Levites, the tribe set apart to take care of his holy place, the Levites' special role. God told Moses, "The Levites belong to me. When I saved every firstborn in Israel during the Passover, I claimed them as my own. But instead of taking the firstborn from every family, I'm setting apart the whole tribe of Levi to serve me." Their job? Handle everything related to the tabernacle, setting it up, taking it down, carrying it, and making sure no one unqualified got too close. If an outsider even tried to touch the sacred things, they'd be in serious danger. The sons of Levi. Levi's descendants were divided into three major clans, each with their own responsibilities. Gershonites, 7,500 men, camped on the west side of the tabernacle, took care of the tent coverings, curtains, and entrance screens.
Kohathites, 8,600 men, camped on the south side, responsible for the most sacred objects, like the Ark of the Covenant, lampstand, and altars.
Merarites, 6,200 men, camped on the north side,
handled the heavy lifting, frames, bars, posts, and bases of the tabernacle.
Moses, Aaron, and Aaron's sons camped on the east side, near the entrance, because they were the high priests in charge of the whole operation, swapping the firstborn for the Levites. God told Moses to count every firstborn son in Israel. There were 22,273 of them. Then he had Moses count the Levite men. There were 22,000 of them. Since the Levites were taking the place of the firstborns, there was a 273-person difference. To balance it out, God told Moses to have the Israelites pay a redemption price, 5 shekels per extra firstborn, totaling 1,365 shekels. This money was given to Aaron and his sons as part of their priestly duties. The big picture. This wasn't just about numbers. This was about order and dedication. The Levites were chosen to serve God directly, making sure his presence remained among the people while keeping everything in divine order. Moses followed everything exactly as God commanded. Numbers 4. Now God gave Moses and Aaron instructions on how the Levites should handle the tabernacle when it was time to move. Each Levite clan had specific duties, and they had to follow them exactly. This wasn't a job for just anybody. The Kohathites, handling the sacred objects. God told Moses, when it's time to move, Aaron and his sons must cover the sacred objects first. If the Kohathites touch them directly, they will die. Here's the process. 1. The Ark of the Covenant, covered with the curtain, then leather, then a blue cloth. 2. The table of showbread, covered with a blue cloth, plates and bowls left in place, then covered with a red cloth and leather.
3. The lampstand and utensils, wrapped in blue cloth, then leather. 4. The altar of incense, covered with blue cloth and leather. 5. The bronze altar, cleaned, covered with purple cloth and wrapped in leather. Only after Aaron's sons finished covering everything could the Kohathites come and carry it. Their job was serious. No touching, only carrying. The Gershonites, carrying the tabernacle coverings. Moses counted the Gershonites aged 30 to 50 who could serve, and their job was to carry the curtains, coverings, entrance screens, and cords. They worked under Aaron's son Ithamar and transported everything on carts. The Merarites, handling the heavy structure. The Merarites were assigned to carry the wooden frames, bars, pillars, bases, and ropes of the tabernacle. They also worked under Ithamar and had carts to move everything. The census of the Levites on duty. Moses counted all Levite men aged 30 to 50 who were strong enough to serve. Kohathites, 2,750 men. Gershonites, 2,630 men. Merarites, 3,200 men.
Total Levites on duty, 8,580 men. Each clan had its role and nobody could step outside their assignment. The big picture. God wasn't playing about his order. The Levites weren't just random helpers. They were set apart to handle his holy presence with respect and precision. If they followed his instructions, everything would run smoothly. Moses and Aaron made sure they did exactly what God commanded.
Numbers 5. Now God gave Moses instructions to keep the camp clean, holy, and in order.
Removing the unclean. God told Moses, anyone who has a skin disease, a discharge, or has touched a dead body must be sent outside the camp. This wasn't about rejection. It was about keeping the camp pure because God's presence was among them. Once they were clean again, they could return.
Making things right. Confession and restitution.
God said, "If someone sins against another person, they've also sinned against me. They must confess what they did and pay back the full amount, plus an extra 20% as a penalty." If the wrong person had no family to receive the payment, it went to the priests. The test for a suspicious husband.
If a man started feeling jealous, thinking his wife had been unfaithful but had no proof, he could bring her to the priest for a test of innocence. Here's how it worked. 1. The priest brought her before God and uncovered her hair.
2. She held an offering of remembrance in her hands. 3. The priest wrote a curse on a scroll and washed the ink into bitter water. 4. The woman had to drink the water. If she was guilty, she'd suffer sickness and infertility. If she was innocent, nothing would happen, and she'd be able to have children.
This wasn't about humiliating women. It was a way to let God be the judge when no one else knew the truth. The big picture.
God wanted Israel to be a community of honesty, purity, and peace. He set up laws to keep the people accountable and ensure that sin, injustice, and disorder didn't spread. Moses and the Israelites followed everything just as God commanded.
Number 6. Now God gave Moses instructions about a special vow called the Nazirite vow, a way for someone to dedicate themselves fully to God for a set period of time.
The Nazirite vow, a special commitment to God. Anyone, man or woman, could take this vow, but there were strict rules. 1. No alcohol or anything from grapes. No wine, no vinegar, no grape juice, no raisins. Nothing from the vine. 2. No haircuts. They had to let their hair grow out the whole time as a sign of their vow. 3. No touching dead bodies. Even if a family member died, they couldn't go near them. If they accidentally broke the vow, like touching a dead body, they had to shave their head, bring an offering, and start over.
Ending the Nazirite vow.
When their time of dedication was over, they had to
shave their head and burn the hair as an offering. Bring sacrifices, animals, bread, and drink offerings. Be officially released from their vow by the priest. After that, they could return to normal life.
The priestly blessing. God told Moses to have Aaron and his sons bless the people with these words. "The Lord bless you and keep you. The Lord make his face shine on you and be gracious to you.
The Lord turn his face towards you and give you peace."
This was more than just nice words. It was God's covering and favor over his people. The big picture.
The Nazirite vow showed total dedication to God, and the priestly blessing reminded the people that God was with them. Everything in Israel was designed to keep the people aligned with God's presence, protection, and purpose. Number 7.
When Moses finished setting up the tabernacle, God told the leaders of Israel to bring offerings to dedicate it. Each tribe brought gifts to support the work of the Levites and offerings for the altar. Tribal leaders bring their gifts. The 12 tribal leaders brought 6 carts and 12 oxen to help the Levites carry the tabernacle. God told Moses how to divide them. The Gershonites, who handled the fabrics and coverings, got 2 carts and 4 oxen. The Merarites, who handled the heavy frames and posts, got 4 carts and 8 oxen.
The Kohathites got none because they carried the holy things on their shoulders.
Dedication offerings. 1 tribe per day.
For 12 days straight, each tribe brought the same offering to dedicate the altar. Here's what each one gave. A silver plate, 3 pounds, and a silver bowl, 1.5 pounds, filled with flour and oil for grain offerings. A gold dish, 4 ounces, filled with incense. 1 young bull, 1 ram, and 1 male lamb for burnt offerings,
1 male goat for a sin offering, 2 oxen, 5 rams, 5 male goats, and 5 male lambs for a peace offering.
Even though each offering was the same, each tribe got its own special day to bring their gift before God. Total offerings for the altar. At the end of 12 days, the combined total of offerings was 12 bulls, 12 rams, and 12 lambs for burnt offerings,
12 male goats for sin offerings, 24 bulls, 60 rams, 60 male goats, and 60 lambs for peace offerings.
Moses meets with God.
After everything was dedicated, Moses went into the tent of meeting and heard God's voice speaking from above the Ark of the Covenant between the 2 cherubim. The big picture. This chapter shows how everyone had a part in honoring God. Each tribe gave what they had, and together they created a fully dedicated and prepared place for God's presence. At the end of it all, God spoke, showing he was with them. Numbers 8. Now God gave Moses instructions about setting up the Levites and the golden lampstand in the tabernacle. The lampstand, keeping the light burning. God told Moses, "Tell Aaron to set up the 7 lamps so they shine forward." Aaron did exactly that, making sure the golden lampstand was arranged as God had commanded. This lampstand wasn't just decoration, it represented God's light and presence always shining among his people. The Levites' cleansing and dedication. Before the Levites could serve, they had to go through a cleansing ceremony. First, sprinkling of purification water to cleanse them spiritually.
2. Shaving their whole bodies, a sign of renewal and purity.
3. Washing their clothes to make them clean before serving. 4. Sacrificial offerings, a bull for a sin offering and another for a burnt offering. The Israelites laid hands on the Levites, officially setting them apart for God's work. Aaron then presented them before God as a wave offering, symbolizing that they now fully belong to him. The Levites replaced the firstborn. God reminded Moses, "The Levites are mine. When I spared Israel's firstborn in Egypt, I claimed them as my own. But instead of taking every family's firstborn, I set apart the Levites to serve in their place."
From then on, the Levites took care of the tabernacle, making sure everything was in order for worship.
Levite service, age requirements. God set specific work years for the Levites.
They started their official service at age 25.
At age 50, they retired from heavy work but could still assist younger Levites.
The big picture.
This chapter highlights God's order and holiness. The Levites had to be purified before serving, showing that working in God's presence wasn't something to take lightly. At the same time, the lampstand symbolized that God's light was always shining over his people. Everything was set in place for worship to be done the right way. Numbers 9. The second Passover.
A year after leaving Egypt, God told Moses, "It's time for the Israelites to celebrate Passover again." So they did, on the 14th day of the first month, just like they had in Egypt.
But some men came to Moses with a problem. They had touched a dead body and were considered unclean, meaning they weren't allowed to take part in the Passover. They asked, "Why should we be left out just because we handled a dead body?" Moses didn't make up an answer. He took the issue straight to God. God responded, "If someone is unclean or traveling during Passover, they can celebrate it 1 month later, on the 14th day of the second month." But he also warned, anyone who refuses to celebrate Passover without a valid reason will be cut off from the people. God also made it clear foreigners living among the Israelites could celebrate Passover too, but they had to follow the same rules. The cloud over the tabernacle, God's guidance. From the day the tabernacle was set up, a cloud covered it during the day and a fire rested on it at night. This was God's way of leading his people. When the cloud lifted, they packed up and moved. When the cloud stayed, they camped and waited, whether for a day, a month, or even years. No one decided when to move on their own. They only moved when God said so. The big picture. This chapter shows that God makes a way for those who truly want to follow Him, like the unclean men who still wanted to celebrate Passover. It also shows that God was their guide. His presence in the cloud and fire let them know exactly when to move and when to stay. Trusting His timing was key. Numbers 10. Silver trumpets, calling the people to move. God told Moses to make 2 silver trumpets to be used for calling the people together and signaling when it was time to move. Both trumpets blown, everyone gathered at the tabernacle. One trumpet blown, only the leaders gathered. Short blasts, time to pack up and move. Long blast before battle, a reminder that God would fight for them. Blowing the trumpets during feasts and sacrifices, a way to honor God. These trumpets weren't just noise, they were a direct communication system between God, Moses, and the people. Israel's first journey from Mount Sinai. On the 20th day of the 2nd month, the cloud lifted from the tabernacle, signaling it was time to leave Mount Sinai. The order of movement was set. First, Judah's tribe led the way. 2. The Gershonites and Merarites carried the tabernacle's coverings and frames. 3rd, Reuben, Simeon, and Gad marched next. 4. The Kohathites carried the sacred objects, the ark, lampstand, altars. 5. Ephraim, Manasseh, and Benjamin followed. 6th, Dan, Asher, and Naphtali protected the rear. Everyone moved in order, just as God had commanded. Moses' conversation with Hobab. Moses invited Hobab, his Midianite brother-in-law, to come with them, saying, "Come with us. God is leading us to great things." But Hobab wasn't sure. He wanted to go back home. Moses urged him, "We need your help. You know the wilderness well, and if you come, you'll share in God's blessings." God leads the way. As they traveled, the Ark of the Covenant led the way, and the cloud covered them, guiding and protecting them. Every time they moved, Moses prayed, "Rise up, Lord, scatter your enemies." And when they stopped, he prayed, "Return, Lord, to your people." The big picture. This chapter marks a new beginning. Israel was finally moving toward the promised land. The trumpets, the cloud, and the order of travel all showed that God was leading them step by step. Moses also showed the importance of inviting others into God's blessings, as he did with Hobab. Numbers 11. Complaints in the camp. As soon as the Israelites left Mount Sinai, they started complaining, and God wasn't happy. Fire from the Lord burned the edges of the camp, and the people cried out to Moses. When Moses prayed, God stopped the fire. They named that place Taberah, which means burning, as a reminder. The people crave meat. Soon after, the complaining got worse. Some of the non-Israelites among them started craving meat, and soon the whole camp was crying. "We're tired of this manna. Back in Egypt, we had fish, cucumbers, melons, leeks, onions, and garlic. Now all we have is this bread from heaven." Even though God had been providing miraculous food every day, they romanticized slavery instead of trusting his provision. Moses feels overwhelmed. Moses heard all the crying and got frustrated. He asked God, "Why did you put this burden on me? Did I give birth to these people? Am I supposed to carry them like a mother? Where am I supposed to get meat for them? Just kill me now if this is how it's going to be." Moses was stressed. The weight of leading was getting to him. God's solution, 70 elders and quail. God answered Moses in 2 ways. 1. Help for Moses. God told him to gather 70 elders. He took some of the spirit that was on Moses and put it on them, so they could help lead the people. When the Spirit came on them, they prophesied, showing they were chosen by God. 2. Meat for the people. God told the Israelites, "You want meat? I'll give you so much meat it'll come out of your noses." He sent a massive wind that blew quail from the sea, covering the ground 3 feet deep. The people greedily gathered quail, but before they could even finish eating, God sent a plague because of their ungratefulness and greed. Many died there, and the place was named Kibroth Hattava, graves of craving.
The big picture.
This chapter highlights 3 things.
1. Complaining blinds us to God's blessings. The Israelites missed the miracle of manna because they were focused on what they didn't have.
2. Leaders need support. Even Moses needed help carrying the burden of leadership. 3. Be careful what you crave. The people got what they wanted, but it came with consequences. Numbers 12.
After this, the Israelites moved on to Hazeroth, still learning what it meant to trust God's provision.
Miriam and Aaron started talking crazy about Moses because he married a Cushite woman. Fun fact, Moses was married to a black woman. The Cushites were an African people with dark skin, as seen. The Cushites were an African people with dark skin, as depicted in ancient Egyptian art and historical records. They were low-key salty, saying, "Does God only speak through Moses? Ain't we prophets too?" But God heard all that. Now, Moses was the most humble man walking the earth, so he wasn't even tripping. But God wasn't about to let that slide. He told all 3 of them, Moses, Aaron, and Miriam, to meet him at the entrance of the tent. When they pulled up, God came down in a cloud and called Aaron and Miriam forward. He said, "Listen up. When I speak to prophets, I might use dreams or visions, but Moses, that's my guy. I talk to him face to face, no riddles, no mysteries. So why were y'all bold enough to speak against him?" Then God left, and as soon as the cloud lifted, Miriam's skin turned white with disease. She was looking real bad. Aaron panicked and begged Moses, "Please, don't let her go out like this. We were out of line. Don't let her die looking like she's already gone." Moses, being the one he was, called out to God, "Please heal her, Lord." But God said, if her father had spit in her face, she'd have to sit in shame for 7 days. So let her be put outside the camp for a week, then she can come back.
So they sent Miriam out for 7 days, and nobody moved forward until she came back. After that, the people packed up and continued on their journey.
The big picture.
1. Pride leads to downfall. Miriam and Aaron let pride make them question God's chosen leader. 2. God defends his own. Moses didn't have to argue. God handled it.
3. Mercy and discipline go hand in hand. Miriam was healed, but she still faced consequences. After this, the Israelites moved on to Paran, where their next big test awaited. Numbers 13. Spies sent to the Promised Land.
God told Moses to send some men to scout out the land of Canaan, the place he already promised to give them. Moses picked one leader from each of the 12 tribes and sent them to check things out. Among them were Caleb from Judah and Joshua from Ephraim. Moses told them, "Go see what the land is like. Check if the people there are strong or weak, if they're many or few. See if the land is good for farming, if the cities are fortified, and if the soil is rich. Bring back some fruit so we can see what we're working with." So they went and scouted the land from the wilderness up to Hebron, where the descendants of giants lived. When they reached a valley, they cut down a huge cluster of grapes, so big that 2 men had to carry it on a pole. They also grabbed some pomegranates and figs. After 40 days, they came back to give their report. They told Moses and the people, "Yo, the land is everything God said, flowing with milk and honey.
Look at these grapes. But listen, the people there are strong, the cities are massive, and we even saw giants." Caleb spoke up. "Nah, we got this. Let's go take the land. We can handle them." But the other scouts weren't feeling it. "Man, they're too powerful. We felt like grasshoppers compared to them, and that's probably how they saw us too." They spread fear among the people, saying, "That land will eat us alive. Everybody there is huge." Instead of trusting God, they let their fear take over, making the whole camp doubt what God had promised them. The big picture. 1. Perspective is everything. All 12 spies saw the same land, but 10 saw fear and 2 saw faith. 2. Doubt spreads fast. The negative report caused fear and rebellion to rise among the people. 3. Faith requires action. Caleb and Joshua believed God's promise, but the others focused on the obstacles. This moment would test Israel's trust in God. Would they move forward in faith or turn back in fear? Numbers 14. Israel panics and rebels. After hearing the bad report from the 10 spies, the Israelites broke down crying all night. Then they started complaining. "Why did God bring us here just to die? We should have stayed in Egypt. Let's pick a new leader and go back." Joshua and Caleb tried to encourage them. Joshua and Caleb tore their clothes in frustration and said, "The land is amazing. If God is with us, we will take it. Don't be afraid. God will fight for us." But instead of listening, the people talked about stoning them. God steps in. God appeared at the tabernacle and told Moses, "How long will these people refuse to trust me? After everything I've done, they still doubt me. I should wipe them out and start over with you, Moses." But Moses pleaded, "Lord, if you do that, the nations will say you couldn't finish what you started. Show them your mercy instead." God's judgment. 40 years in the wilderness. God listened to Moses and didn't destroy them, but he gave them a serious consequence. Everyone 20 and older who doubted would die in the wilderness. None of them would see the promised land except Joshua and Caleb. The people would wander for 40 years, 1 year for each day the spies explored the land. The 10 spies who spread fear, God struck them with a plague and they died on the spot. Israel tries to fix it too late. When the people heard this, they mourned and said, "We'll go now. We'll fight for the land." But Moses warned them, "God isn't with you in this. If you go now, you'll lose." They ignored him and went to fight anyway, but without God's protection, they were defeated badly. The big picture. 1. Fear and doubt can cost you blessings. Israel missed out on God's promise because they let fear lead them. 2. Delayed obedience is still disobedience. Trying to fix things after rejecting God's plan doesn't work. 3. God's mercy is real, but so is his discipline. He forgave them but still made them face the consequences. This chapter marks a turning point. Instead of entering the promised land, Israel was now stuck wandering in the wilderness for 40 years. Numbers 15. Offerings for when they enter the land. Even though Israel was sentenced to 40 years in the wilderness, God still reminded them that one day their children would enter the promised land. He gave Moses instructions for how they should offer sacrifices once they got there. Every burnt offering or peace offering had to come with grain, oil, and wine as a thanksgiving to God. This applied to both Israelites and foreigners living among them. God made it clear, there is one law for everyone. Unintentional versus intentional sin. God explained the difference between accidental sin and willful rebellion. If someone sinned unintentionally, they could bring an offering to be forgiven. But if someone sinned on purpose with a rebellious heart, they would be cut off from the community because they were rejecting God Himself.
A man is punished for breaking the Sabbath. While in the wilderness, a man was caught gathering wood on the Sabbath. Since God had commanded them not to work on that day, Moses asked what should be done.
God answered, "He must be put to death." The people carried out the sentence, showing that God's commands weren't suggestions. They were serious.
Tassels as a reminder. God told the Israelites to sew blue tassels onto their clothes as a reminder to obey His commands. When you see the tassels, remember to follow my ways and not your own desires. I am the Lord who brought you out of Egypt. The big picture.
First, God's promises still stand. Even though Israel was punished, God still planned for their future in the promised land.
2. Obedience matters. Sin wasn't just a mistake. Willful disobedience had real consequences. 3. We need constant reminders. The tassels were like a spiritual accountability system, helping them stay focused on God's commands. Even in discipline, God was guiding them, teaching them, and preparing them for what was ahead.
Number 16.
Korah's rebellion.
A man named Korah from the tribe of Levi stirred up a rebellion against Moses and Aaron. He teamed up with Dathan, Abiram, and On from the tribe of Reuben, and 250 other leaders joined them.
They confronted Moses and Aaron, saying,
"Who put you in charge?
We're all God's people. Why do you act like you're better than us?" Moses' response.
Moses fell on his face before God, then told Korah and his followers,
"Tomorrow morning, God will show who really belongs to Him. Bring your incense burners, and let's see who He chooses." Then he warned Korah, "You're not rebelling against me. You're rebelling against God." Moses also sent for Dathan and Abiram, but they refused to come. Instead, they said, "You took us out of Egypt, a land of milk and honey, only to make us die in this desert. Now you want to rule over us too." Moses was frustrated and told God, "Don't accept their offering. I've done nothing wrong to these men."
God's judgment. The earth swallows them. The next day, Korah and his followers stood before the tent of meeting with their incense burners. Then God spoke to Moses and Aaron, warning them to move away from the rebellious group.
Moses told the people, "Step back from these men. If they die a normal death, then God didn't send me. But if the earth opens up and swallows them, you'll know they rejected the Lord."
Right after Moses finished speaking, the ground split open, swallowing Korah, Dathan, Abiram, their families, and everything they owned. Then the earth closed over them, and they were gone.
At the same time, fire from heaven consumed the 250 men who had offered incense. A plague breaks out.
The next day, the people blamed Moses and Aaron for what happened, saying, "You killed God's people." God's anger burned again, and a plague broke out in the camp. But Moses told Aaron to grab his incense burner and make atonement for the people. Aaron ran into the crowd, standing between the living and the dead, and the plague stopped. But 14,700 people had already died.
The big picture.
1. Rebelling against God's chosen leaders is rebelling against God. Korah's pride led to his downfall.
2. God takes holiness seriously. Only those He appoints can serve in certain roles. 3. Intercession saves lives. Aaron's quick action stopped the plague, showing the power of a true priest's prayers. This chapter is a warning about jealousy, pride, and rejecting God's order, and a reminder that God defends those He calls. Number 17. The test of the staffs.
After Korah's rebellion, the Israelites were still complaining, saying Moses and Aaron killed the Lord's people. So God decided to prove once and for all who he had chosen as high priest. He told Moses, "Take a staff from each of the 12 tribes and write each leader's name on it. Write Aaron's name on the staff of Levi. Place them in the tabernacle overnight, and the one that buds will show whom I have chosen." Aaron's staff blooms. The next day, when Moses went into the tent of meeting, Aaron's staff had not only sprouted but blossomed and produced ripe almonds. Moses brought out all the staffs, and each tribe took back their own. But Aaron's staff was left inside the Ark of the Covenant as a permanent sign that God had chosen him. The people's reaction. The Israelites were terrified and said, "We're doomed. Anyone who comes near the tabernacle will die." They finally understood that God was serious about holiness and that only those he appointed could serve in his presence. The big picture. 1. God confirms his chosen leaders. Aaron didn't have to argue. God proved he had chosen him. 2. God brings life where there was none. A dead staff came to life, just like God brings life to those who follow him. 3. Reverence for God is necessary. The people realized God's holiness wasn't to be taken lightly.
This chapter settled the question of who was truly called to lead in God's presence and left no room for further rebellion. Numbers 18.
Responsibilities of priests and Levites.
After the rebellion and complaints, God spoke directly to Aaron, making it clear what his responsibilities were as high priest. Duties of the priests, Aaron and his sons.
They were fully responsible for the tabernacle and anything related to worship. Only they could approach the most holy place. Anyone else who tried would die.
They had to offer sacrifices on behalf of the people, keeping Israel in right standing with God.
Duties of the Levites. The Levites were given to Aaron as helpers, but they were not allowed to go near the sacred objects or the altar. Only the priests could do that.
If they followed God's instructions, the entire nation would be protected from judgment.
Provision for the priests and Levites.
Since the priests and Levites had no land inheritance, God provided for them through the tithes and offerings from the Israelites. Priests received portions of sacrifices, including grain, oil, wine, and meat. Levites received the tithes, 10%, from the Israelites as their wages for serving in the tabernacle.
The Levites, in turn, had to give 10% of their tithes to the priests as an offering to God.
The big picture.
1. Serving God comes with responsibility. The priests and Levites had a serious duty to uphold God's holiness.
2. God takes care of his servants. Those who worked in the tabernacle didn't have to worry about provision. God made sure they were supported.
3. Spiritual leadership isn't about power, it's about obedience. Unlike Korah, who wanted status, Aaron and his family had to approach their role with humility and reverence. This chapter reinforced the structure of spiritual leadership and showed that God always provides for those who serve him. Numbers 19. The red heifer and purification. God gave Moses and Aaron instructions about how to purify people who became unclean, especially those who had touched a dead body.
The red heifer sacrifice.
The Israelites had to bring a red heifer, a perfect young cow with no defects, to be sacrificed. The priest would kill it outside the camp, burn it completely, and mix its ashes with cedar wood, hyssop, and scarlet wool.
These ashes were stored and used to make the water of purification.
Rules for purification. Anyone who touched a dead body was unclean for 7 days. They had to be sprinkled with the water of purification on the 3rd and 7th day to be made clean again. If they didn't go through the process, they remained unclean and were cut off from the community. Even those who handled the ashes of the red heifer became unclean and had to wash their clothes and bathe before returning to camp. The big picture. First, God's holiness required cleanliness. Physical uncleanness was a symbol of sin, and purification was necessary to stay in God's presence. 2. The red heifer foreshadowed Jesus. Just as its sacrifice brought purification, Jesus' sacrifice cleanses us from sin. 3. Ignoring God's way led to separation. Those who refused purification were cut off, showing that sin separates people from God. This chapter reminded Israel that God's presence required purity, and it pointed to a future ultimate sacrifice that would bring complete cleansing. Numbers 20. Miriam's death. The Israelites arrived at Kadesh in the wilderness, and there Miriam died and was buried. This was a significant moment. Miriam was Moses' and Aaron's sister and a key leader in Israel's journey. Water from the rock. Moses' mistake. Once again, the people started complaining about no water, saying, "Why did you bring us out here to die? We had it better in Egypt." Moses and Aaron went before God, and he told Moses, "Take your staff, gather the people, and speak to the rock. Water will come out for them to drink." But instead of speaking to the rock, Moses hit it twice with his staff. Water still flowed, but God immediately told Moses and Aaron, "Because you didn't trust me enough to honor me before the people, you won't enter the promised land." This place was named Meribah, quarreling, because the people argued with God, and Moses acted out of frustration instead of obedience. Edom refuses to let Israel pass. Moses sent messengers to the king of Edom, asking permission to pass through their land peacefully. He reminded them, "We've been through a lot: slavery, deliverance, and now this long journey. We won't touch your fields or drink your water. We'll stay on the road." But Edom refused, even bringing out an army to block them, so Israel turned away and took another route. Aaron's death. At Mount Hor, God told Moses, "It's time for Aaron to die. Take him up the mountain, remove his priestly garments, and put them on his son Eleazar." Moses did as God commanded. Aaron died there, and Eleazar became the new high priest. The Israelites mourned Aaron's death for 30 days. The big picture. 1. Obedience matters. Moses let frustration get the best of him and disobeyed God's instructions, which cost him the promised land. 2. Not everyone will help you on your journey. Edom refused to assist Israel, and sometimes opposition is part of the process. 3. Leadership passes on, but God remains. Aaron's time ended, but Eleazar stepped up, showing that God's work continues through generations. This chapter marks a turning point. Both Miriam and Aaron are gone, and Moses is nearing the end of his leadership. The promised land is close, but challenges remain. Numbers 21. Victory over the Canaanites. As the Israelites traveled, the king of Arad, a Canaanite king, attacked them and took some of their people captive. The Israelites prayed to God, saying, "If you give us victory, we'll completely destroy their cities." God heard them, gave them the victory, and they destroyed the Canaanite cities. They named the place Hormah, destruction. The bronze snake, healing through faith. As they continued their journey, the people started complaining again. "Why did you bring us out of Egypt to die? There's no bread, no water, and we hate this manna." Because of their rebellion, God sent poisonous snakes into the camp, and many Israelites were bitten and died. The people ran to Moses and said, "We sinned by speaking against God and you. Please ask him to take the snakes away." God told Moses, "Make a bronze snake and put it on a pole. Anyone who looks at it will be healed." Moses obeyed, and whoever looked at the bronze snake was saved. This was a powerful foreshadowing of Jesus. Just as the snake was lifted up to bring healing, Jesus would one day be lifted up on the cross to bring salvation. John 3:14-15. Journey through the wilderness. The Israelites continued traveling, moving from Oboth to Iyebarim, then to the valley of Zereh, and finally to the Arnon River. Along the way, they sang a song to praise God for providing water, a rare moment of gratitude. Victory over Sihon and Og. When Israel reached the land of the Amorites, Moses sent a message to King Sihon asking for peaceful passage, but Sihon refused and attacked Israel instead. God gave Israel a major victory. They conquered the Amorites and took their land. Next, they faced King Og of Bashan, a giant with a massive kingdom. God told Moses, "Don't be afraid. I have already handed him over to you." Israel fought and completely defeated Og and his people, taking over their land too. The big picture. 1. Trusting God leads to victory. When Israel trusted God, they won battles. When they complained, disaster struck. 2. God's healing requires faith. The bronze snake showed that salvation comes by faith, not works, a picture of Jesus' future sacrifice. 3. God was preparing them for the promised land. The victories over Sihon and Og meant that Israel was now closer than ever to entering Canaan. God was proving that he was with them, fighting for them, if only they would trust him. Numbers 22. So Israel was out here moving through the land, and they had just taken down the Amorites. Word got out, and Balak, the king of Moab, got real nervous. He saw how deep Israel's squad was and thought, if they come through here, they gon' wipe us out like they did the others. So he linked up with the Midianites like, we gotta do something about this. Balak sent messengers to a man named Balaam, who had a reputation for speaking blessings and curses that actually stuck. He hit Balaam up like, look, there's a whole nation camped out near me, and they too powerful. Come curse them for me so I got a shot at winning. He even offered Balaam a bag for his services. Balaam told him, let me check in with God first. That night, God came to him like, don't go with them, and don't you dare curse my people. They're blessed. So Balaam sent the messengers back like, sorry, can't do it. Balak wasn't trying to take no for an answer. He sent more people, higher ranking this time with promises of even bigger rewards. Balaam told them the same thing. I can't do nothing outside of what God tells me. But he checked in with God again, and this time God said, fine, go with them, but you better only say what I tell you. Next morning, Balaam saddled up his donkey and rode out, but God wasn't happy with how Balaam was moving, so he sent an angel to block the way. The wild part? Balaam couldn't see the angel, but his donkey could. The donkey swerved off the road, and Balaam started hitting it to get back on track. Then the angel moved ahead and stood in a narrow path. The donkey tried to squeeze by, but ended up crushing Balaam's foot against a wall. Balaam got mad and hit the donkey again. The angel moved one more time to an even tighter spot, where the donkey couldn't go left or right. The donkey just sat down, refusing to move. Balaam lost it and started beating the donkey. Then, boom, the donkey started talking. It turned to Balaam like, why you keep hitting me? Have I ever done you dirty before? Balaam, instead of freaking out that his donkey just spoke, snapped back. Because you acting up. If I had a sword, I'd end you right now. Then God opened Balaam's eyes, and he finally saw the angel standing there with a sword. The angel was like, you better be glad your donkey got more sense than you. If it wasn't for that donkey stopping, I would have taken you out by now. Balaam humbled himself real quick like, my bad, I didn't know. Should I turn back? The angel told him, nah, keep going, But remember, say only what God tells you to say."
So Balaam pulled up to Balak, who was like, "Finally, what took you so long?" Balaam told him straight up, "I can only say what God puts in my mouth." And that's where the story keeps going. Balak kept trying to get Balaam to curse Israel, but every time Balaam opened his mouth, blessings came out instead. God made sure his people stayed covered, no matter what their enemies plotted. Moral of the story? You can't mess up what God has already blessed, and sometimes the signs be right in front of you. You just gotta open your eyes. Or, pay attention to your donkey. Numbers 23. So Balak and Balaam were posted up, ready to do this whole cursing thing. Balak was like, "Aight, let's get started." He took Balaam to a high place where they could see some of Israel's camp. Then Balaam told him, "Build 7 altars right here and bring me 7 bulls and 7 rams." Balak did what he said and they offered the sacrifices. Then Balaam told Balak, "Stay here by the altars. I'm going to check in with God and see what he says." Balaam went off, and sure enough, God gave him a message. When Balaam came back, he told Balak straight up, "Listen, man, God brought these people here, and I can't curse what he already blessed. They're solid. They're different. They don't move like the other nations. God is with them, and there's nothing I can do about it." Balak was big mad. "Bruh, I brought you here to curse them, not bless them." Balaam just shrugged. "I told you, I can only say what God tells me to say." Balak, still not giving up, was like, "Maybe it's just a location. Let's go somewhere else." So he took Balaam to another high spot, hoping for a different outcome. They ran the same play. 7 altars, 7 bulls, 7 rams. Balaam went to check in with God again, and when he came back, he dropped another message. God ain't like people. He doesn't lie or switch up. If he says something, he means it. He already blessed these people, and nothing can change that. No curse, no magic, no tricks can touch them. Matter of fact, they're about to take over. They're like lions, ready to pounce, and they ain't stopping till they win. Balak was heated. If you're not gonna curse them, at least don't bless them. Balaam hit him with the same response, "I can only say what God tells me." Balak, still trying, was like, "Okay, one more time. Let's go to another spot." So they moved again, built more altars, made more sacrifices, hoping for a different answer. And that's where things kept heading. No matter what Balak did, Balaam couldn't go against God's plan. Moral of the story? If God said you're blessed, you're blessed. No enemy, no scheme, no negativity can cancel what God already put in motion. Numbers 24. By this point, Balaam realized that no matter what, God was only going to bless Israel. So this time, he didn't even go through the motions of checking for curses. He just let God speak through him. When he looked out and saw Israel camped out, the Spirit of God hit him, and he started speaking. "These people are thriving. They're spread out like lush gardens by the river, like trees the Lord himself planted. They're blessed, they're strong, and their king is powerful. God brought them up and gave them the victory. No one can take them down. Anyone who tries to curse them, they'll be cursed instead. But whoever blesses them, they'll be blessed too." Balak lost it. "Bruh, I brought you here to take them down, and you've done nothing but bless them 3 times. He clapped his hands in frustration and told Balaam, "Get out of here." "I was ready to bless you with riches, but God messed that up for you." Balaam wasn't fazed. "I told you from the start, I can't go against God, even if you gave me a whole palace full of silver and gold. But before I go, let me drop one last message on you." Then Balaam hit Balak with a prophecy. "I see it, but not yet. A ruler is coming from Israel, a bright star rising up. He's going to crush his enemies, take down kingdoms, and rule with power. Nobody will be able to stand against him."
Then Balaam went on to predict how Israel was going to dominate the nations around them. He called out Moab, Edom, Amalek, and the Kenites, letting them know that their time was coming. Then, after dropping all that truth, Balaam got up and went home. Balak, defeated, did the same. Moral of the story? When God's hand is on something, no amount of opposition can stop it. And that prophecy about a ruler coming? That was a glimpse of Jesus, way before he even showed up. God's plan was already in motion, and nothing was going to change that. Numbers 25. So while Israel was camped out near Moab, some of the men started messing around with Moabite women. These women led them into idol worship, convincing them to bow down and make sacrifices to Baal, one of the Moabite gods. This wasn't just some small slip-up. Israel straight up turned their backs on God and got caught up in this mess. God wasn't having it. His anger burned against Israel, and he told Moses, "Take out the leaders who allowed this to happen and put an end to this before my wrath takes over the whole camp." So Moses told the judges of Israel, "Handle everyone involved in this idol worship." While all this was going down, one Israelite had the audacity to walk right in front of Moses and the people with a Midianite woman, acting like everything was cool. But Phinehas, the grandson of Aaron, saw what was happening and wasn't about to let that slide. He grabbed a spear, went into their tent, and ran both of them through, stopping the sin right then and there. That moment changed everything. The plague that had broken out because of Israel's sin stopped, but by then, 24,000 people had already died. God spoke to Moses and said, "Phinehas has just turned away my anger from Israel. Because he was zealous for my honor, I'm making a covenant of peace with him. His descendants will always have a priesthood because he stood for what was right." Then God told Moses, "Listen, these Midianites have been leading y'all into sin. They tricked you into worshiping Baal. This ain't over. Handle them." Moral of the story? Playing around with the wrong influences can lead you down a dangerous path. Israel let temptation pull them away from God, and it cost them heavy. But Phinehas, he stood up for righteousness, and God blessed him for it. Sometimes doing the right thing means taking a stand, even when nobody else will. Numbers 26. After the whole situation with the plague, God told Moses and Eleazar, Aaron's son, to take a new census of the Israelites. Basically, count up all the men 20 years old and up who were able to fight. So they went tribe by tribe, counting up the numbers. Reuben, 43,730. Reuben was the oldest son, but his crew had some drama back in the day when Dathan and Abiram rebelled with Korah and got swallowed up by the earth. Simeon, 22,200. Gad, 40,500. Judah, 76,500. Judah's tribe stayed strong. His line would eventually bring forth kings, including David and later Jesus. Issachar, 64,300. Zebulun, 60,500. Manasseh, 52,700. Manasseh's tribe blew up in numbers. They had gained the most since the last count. Ephraim, 32,500. Benjamin, 45,600. Dan, 64,400. Asher, 53,400. Naphtali, 45,400. After adding everyone up, the total count was 601,730 men ready for battle. Then God told Moses, "When y'all divide up the land, do it based on these numbers. The bigger tribes get more land, the smaller ones get less. But every tribe gets their portion by lot, according to my plan." Then they counted up the Levites, since they weren't included in the battle count. They totaled 23,000, but unlike the other tribes, they didn't get their own land. They were set apart for God's work. Now here's the real takeaway. Out of all the men counted in the first census back in Exodus, almost none of them were left. Only Joshua and Caleb had survived because they were the only ones who trusted God back when the spies checked out the promised land. Everyone else from that first generation had died in the wilderness, just like God had said. Moral of the story: God always follows through, both on his promises and his warnings. A whole generation missed out on the blessing because of their doubt, but the next one was getting ready to step into it. Stay faithful, and don't let fear make you miss what God has for you. Numbers 27. So at this point, the Israelites were getting closer to the promised land, and something important came up. A group of 5 sisters, Mahlah, Noah, Hoglah, Milcah, and Tirzah, rolled up on Moses, Eleazar the priest, and the leaders. Their father, Zelophehad, had died in the wilderness, but he didn't have any sons. Normally, only sons inherited land, and since they had no brothers, their family's name and land would have been lost. They stepped up and said, "Why should our father's name disappear just because he didn't have sons? Give us our share of the land too." Moses took their case to God, and God responded, "They're right. If a man dies without sons, his daughter should get his inheritance, and if he has no children at all, it should go to his closest relatives. This is the new law from now on." Then God pulled Moses aside and told him, "It's time. You're not going into the promised land because of what happened back at Meribah when you didn't follow my instructions with the water. But before you go, I need you to pass the leadership on." Moses, instead of complaining, said, "Lord, please pick the right person to lead your people, someone who will guide them like a true shepherd." God told him, "Joshua is the one. He's got my spirit in him." So Moses brought Joshua before Eleazar and the people, laid hands on him, and made it official. Joshua was now the next leader of Israel, and Eleazar, as the high priest, would help guide him by seeking God's direction. Moral of the story: 1. God makes room for justice. Those sisters spoke up, and God made sure they got what was rightfully theirs. If something isn't fair, don't be afraid to stand up for what's right. 2. Everyone has their season. Moses was a great leader, but his time was up. Instead of fighting it, he made sure the next leader was ready. Knowing when to pass the torch is just as important as knowing how to carry it. 3. God chooses leaders who seek him. Joshua wasn't just any warrior, he was a man who trusted God completely. Leadership isn't about power, it's about obedience and faithfulness. Numbers 28. Now that Israel was getting ready to step into the promised land, God reminded them about the offerings and sacrifices they needed to keep bringing. He told Moses, "Make sure my people stay faithful with their sacrifices. These aren't just rituals, they're a way to honor me." Here's the breakdown of what God commanded: daily offerings. Every day they had to offer 2 lambs, one in the morning and one in the evening. Each lamb came with a grain offering, flour mixed with oil, and a drink offering, some wine poured out. This was a constant reminder of their devotion to God. Sabbath offerings. Every Sabbath, Saturday, they had to bring 2 extra lambs along with the grain and drink offerings. This was above and beyond the daily offerings because the Sabbath was a special, holy day. Monthly offerings. At the start of each new month, they had to bring 2 bulls, 1 ram, and 7 lambs as burnt offerings, a male goat as a sin offering. This was a way of dedicating each new month to God. Festival offerings. God also reminded them of the special sacrifices for the big festivals. First Passover and Feast of Unleavened Bread. First month, 14th to 21st day. On the 14th day, they had Passover, a reminder of how God brought them out of Egypt. From the 15th to the 21st, they celebrated the Feast of Unleavened Bread. No yeast, just flatbread, to remember how fast they had to leave Egypt. Each day they offered 2 bulls, 1 ram, and 7 lambs, plus a goat for sin. Second Feast of Weeks, Pentecost, 50 days after Passover. Another big offering, 2 bulls, 1 ram, and 7 lambs, plus a goat for sin. This was a Thanksgiving offering for the first harvest. Moral of the story? 1. Consistency matters. Worship isn't just a one-time thing. It's about daily faithfulness. God wanted His people to stay connected to Him every single day. 2. Honor God with your best. These offerings weren't leftovers. They were quality animals, grain and wine. When we give to God, we should give Him our best, not just what's convenient. 3. Every season belongs to God. Daily, weekly, monthly, and yearly, Israel was reminded that God was at the center of everything. No matter the time, it all belongs to Him. Numbers 29. God kept laying out the game plan for Israel's sacrifices, making sure they stayed consistent in honoring Him, not just daily or weekly, but also during their special festivals. This chapter goes deep into the offerings for the 7th month, which was packed with major holy days. Feast of Trumpets, first day of the 7th month. This was a big celebration where they blew trumpets to mark the start of the month. Special sacrifices, 1 bull, 1 ram, and 7 lambs as burnt offerings, plus a male goat for sin. They were to stop working and offer these in addition to the regular daily and monthly sacrifices. Day of Atonement, 10th day of the 7th month. This was the one day a year when the high priest made a special sacrifice for all of Israel's sins. Offerings, 1 bull, 1 ram, and 7 lambs, plus a male goat for a sin offering. Again, no work was allowed. This was a day of fasting, reflection, and making things right with God. Feast of Tabernacles, 15th to 22nd day of the 7th month. This was a week-long festival celebrating how God provided for Israel in the wilderness. They lived in tents to remember their journey. Day 1. Sacrifices, 13 bulls, 2 rams, 14 lambs, plus a male goat for sin. Days 2 to 7. Each day, the number of bulls decreased by 1, from 13 down to 7, but the rams, lambs, and sin offerings stayed the same. Day 8. Final day, sacred assembly. 1 bull, 1 ram, 7 lambs, plus a male goat for sin. After all that, God reminded them, make sure these sacrifices are done in addition to the regular daily and monthly offerings. Keep bringing your best offerings, grain and drink to me. Moral of the story? 1. God deserves intentional celebration. These feasts weren't random. They were set times to reflect, give thanks, and worship. Make time to honor God in your life. 2. Obedience brings blessing. These sacrifices weren't just rituals. They kept Israel aligned with God. Staying faithful in the small things sets you up for bigger things. 3. Remember where you came from. The Feast of Tabernacles reminded Israel of their journey and how God took care of them. Never forget how far God has brought you. Numbers 30. God gave Moses some straight-up instructions about making vows and keeping promises. This was all about integrity. If you said you were going to do something before God, you had to follow through. If a man makes a vow. If a man made a promise or an oath to God, he had to keep it. No backing out, no excuses. If a woman made a vow. Now, things were a little different depending on her situation. 1. If she was young and still living with her father. If she made a vow and her father agreed, then the vow stood. But if her father disapproved as soon as he heard it, the vow was canceled and she wasn't held accountable. 2. If she was married. If her husband heard her vow and stayed quiet, it meant he agreed, and she had to keep it. But if he canceled it when he heard it, she was released from the vow, and God wouldn't hold it against her.
3. If she was a widow or divorced.
Her vows were automatically binding. No one could overrule them, so she had to follow through. What if a husband changed his mind? Later.
If a husband heard his wife's vow, said nothing at first, but later tried to cancel it, he was guilty for breaking the promise. The bottom line.
God takes words seriously. If you make a promise, you need to mean it.
But there was also protection for women, making sure they weren't held to something unfairly if the men in their lives didn't support it. Moral of the story?
1. Your word matters. If you say you're going to do something, especially to God, follow through. Integrity is everything. 2. God gives structure and protection. These rules weren't about control. They were about making sure no one got bound to a vow they couldn't keep. 3. Think before you speak. Making promises you can't keep leads to unnecessary guilt and consequences. Be wise with your words. Numbers 31. God told Moses, "It's time to settle things with the Midianites. This is the last mission before your time is up." So Moses sent out an army, 12,000 men, 1,000 from each tribe, with Phinehas leading them, carrying the holy gear and trumpets. They went to war and wiped out the Midianites, taking down all their men, including their kings and Balaam, the guy who tried to curse Israel. The Israelites captured the Midianite women, kids, livestock, and valuables, then burned their cities to the ground. They brought everything back to the camp, but when Moses saw that they had spared the women, he got heated. He said, "These are the same women who got y'all caught up in sin at Peor. Y'all should have taken them out too." So, he ordered them to deal with the situation, only letting the young girls who hadn't been with a man live. Then, Moses laid out how to divide the spoils. Half went to the soldiers, half to the people, and a portion was given to God and the priests. The officers realized none of their men had died, so out of gratitude, they brought an extra offering of gold to the Lord. Moses and Eleazar accepted it and dedicated it to the Lord as a memorial for Israel. Numbers 32.
The tribes of Reuben and Gad saw that the land on the east side of the Jordan was perfect for their livestock. So they went to Moses, Eleazar, and the other leaders and said, "Listen, this land is prime for our animals. Instead of crossing the Jordan, can we just settle here?"
Moses wasn't feeling it. He said, "Y'all really about to sit back while your brothers go to war? That's exactly what happened when your ancestors doubted God and refused to take the land. Y'all trying to bring that same energy and get everybody caught up in doubt again?" But the Reubenites and Gadites reassured him, "Nah, we're not abandoning anybody. We'll build places for our families and livestock, but we'll still go fight with Israel until everyone's settled. We won't claim our inheritance until everybody else has theirs." Moses agreed, but warned them, "Keep your word. If y'all don't follow through, it's going to be on your heads. But if you do, then go ahead and settle this land." So they promised again, and Moses assigned the land to them. Later, half the tribe of Manasseh also took some of that territory. They rebuilt cities, fortified them, and named some after their ancestors. Meanwhile, the rest of Israel kept preparing to cross the Jordan into the Promised Land. Numbers 33. This chapter is basically a travel log of everywhere the Israelites went after leaving Egypt. Moses wrote down every stop, and here's the breakdown. They started in Egypt, leaving in a rush after God handled Pharaoh and his people. From there, they hit places like the Red Sea, Marah, where the water was bitter, Elim, where they found fresh springs, Mount Sinai, where they got the commandments, and a whole list of other spots where they camped. Some places had major events, like when God sent quail, when they ran out of water, or when rebellions happened. But a lot were just stops on the journey. After a long time in the wilderness, they finally reached the plains of Moab, right by the Jordan River, across from Jericho. That's when God told Moses, "When y'all cross into the promised land, clear out every enemy nation, destroy their idols, and take full control of the land. If you leave any of them around, they're going to be a problem for you later." Then, God laid out how the land should be divided among the tribes, making it clear that this was the inheritance he had set aside for them.
Numbers 34.
God told Moses, "Here are the exact borders of the land I'm giving y'all." Then he broke it down. Southern border starts from the wilderness of Zin near Edom and runs west to the Mediterranean.
Western border, the whole coastline of the Mediterranean. Northern border starts from Mount Hor and stretches to Lebo Hamath and Zedad. Eastern border runs down the Jordan River from the Sea of Galilee to the Dead Sea.
Then God told Moses to divide the land among the 9.5 tribes that would actually settle there, since Reuben, Gad, and half of Manasseh already claimed land east of the Jordan. To make it official, God appointed Eleazar the priest and Joshua to oversee the land distribution. Plus, one leader from each tribe was chosen to help make sure everything was fair. God listed out their names, making it clear that this was a God-ordained plan. No guesswork, no favoritism. Numbers 35. God told Moses, "The Levites don't get a big chunk of land like the other tribes, but they still need places to live. So, have the Israelites set aside 48 cities for them, along with pasture land for their animals. Out of those 48 cities, 6 were to be special. They were cities of refuge. These were safe zones for anyone who accidentally killed someone." Here's how it worked. If someone took a life on purpose, out of hatred or using a weapon, they were guilty of murder and had to be executed. But if it was truly an accident, like dropping something heavy by mistake, they could flee to a city of refuge and stay there until a fair trial was held.
If the person was found innocent of intentional murder, they had to stay in the city of refuge until the high priest died. If they left early, they could be killed by the victim's family. If they were found guilty, they were put to death. No bail, no bribery, no shortcuts. God made it clear. Bloodshed defiles the land, and only justice could cleanse it. That's why murder had to be handled seriously, and why innocent people had a way to be protected.
This law applied everywhere the Israelites settled, making sure justice was served without corruption or revenge getting out of hand. Numbers 36. Some leaders from the tribe of Manasseh came to Moses with a concern about land inheritance. They said, "God told you to give land to Zelophehad's daughters since he had no sons. But what happens if they marry outside our tribe? Their land will end up belonging to another tribe, and our portion will shrink." Moses took it to God, and he responded with a simple solution. Zelophehad's daughters could marry whoever they wanted, but only within their own tribe. That way, the land would stay in the family, and every tribe would keep its rightful inheritance. The daughters, Mahlah, Tirzah, Hoglah, Milcah, and Noah, did exactly that. They married men from their father's tribe, keeping everything in order just as God commanded. This was the final instruction given in the book of Numbers, making sure the land stayed with the right tribes as Israel prepared to enter the promised land.